Okay, good evening everyone. Welcome back. Tonight we are looking at questions that have been asked on our website. This week I'm sort of taking off, so you'll notice I wasn't here on Saturday and then Monday again. But I'm here today. We only have a few questions, so it might be short. I'm assuming because I've been away, people have been away, but a few questions might just mean that everyone's got all their answers, which is good. If you have no questions, it's quick practice. Okay, but we'll go through the ones we have. Asking questions is good. If you have questions and you don't ask them, that's bad. Because the doubt will prevent you from progressing. So if you have questions, you should ask. And you shouldn't just be coming up with questions just for the sake of asking, but when you have them, you should ask. So the first question is if I could go through the Dhamma Sutta. And I've done videos on this sutta. I think the latest one I did, I was just looking, I did one in April. But it seems to me more recently I've been talking about it. I can't remember where. Maybe I did one on the first three discourses or something. The heart of the Dhamma Sutta is the Four Noble Truths. So maybe I can go through them briefly. The Four Noble Truths are the truth of suffering, the cause of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. Each of the truths has a statement of truth. This is the truth, and each one has a action that needs to be performed in regards to the truth. And each one has a realization once that action has been performed. So the truth itself is important. These are the four truths that are noble. Buddhism doesn't recognize truth for truth's sake. It's not just about understanding everything. In a way, you could say that's what becoming a Buddha is all about. A Buddha is about becoming a fully enlightened Buddha. Apparently, is about learning everything or coming to know everything. But the important thing that a Buddha or an Arahant follower comes to know, and really the only important truths, are these four: suffering, the cause of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. The action in regards to each one, so the truth of suffering is to be fully understood. The cause of suffering is to be abandoned. The cessation of suffering is to be realized or seen for oneself, experienced for oneself. And the path is to be cultivated. And so that's really the most important part of the teaching, is what are we going to do about it? And that's the crux of it. The third part is the realization once these actions have been performed, is a description of the attainment of enlightenment. And the Buddha said, it's only when I got through all of this, learning the Four Noble Truths, following the path and attaining the cessation of suffering and coming to that realization, that I called myself a Buddha. And so I think that's really the most important part of the sutta. I mean, there's a little bit more, but the key, this is the turning of the wheel of the Dhamma, and turning the wheel of the Dhamma is those Four Noble Truths. And by proclaiming them, the Buddha did something that couldn't be turned back by anyone. He set in motion a process of enlightenment that was to, last until today. Impossible to stop. Even if someone wanted to stop people from becoming enlightened after that point, not possible. It would roll on and people would become enlightened just through the power of that, the expression of that teaching, the relating it even to such a small audience. Although apparently there were lots of angels listening as well, and probably a lot of them became Sotapanna, although I'm not sure about that. Can't remember the exact orthodoxy about that one. So, but I won't go into detail because I have before. Because here's a question about, again, it's a long one, relating to people's perceived lack of enthusiasm or arrogance because you're being mindful of your feelings. So I won't go into detail about your particular situation, but I mean, it's a clear example of how in ordinary life the practice of mindfulness appears to have disadvantages or can be to your detriment. There's certainly not a uncommon experience where people get angry or upset because of how you've changed or because of the way you act. I mean, I think to some extent that you shouldn't be surprised with that, because a meditator is quite a different sort of person, and the state of mind of a meditator is quite a different state of mind from someone who is constantly engaging and cultivating a culture, really, right? Because if you were living in Thailand or Japan, if you were to jump for joy when someone gave you good news, they might take the gift away from you, think you're crazy or not deserving of it, right? Whereas in the West, you have to be impressed. You have to express you have to be expressive, or people think there's something wrong with you. So there are some neutral aspects of culture, and I think that's probably where your solution lies, in finding a way to be expressive but still mindful, because I've seen it done, and it is possible. We as meditators, it doesn't mean we can't be expressive, but there's a line, and culture generally crosses this line. So Asian people tend to be under-expressive and purposefully trying to be impressive by how calm and collected they are, which is ego, which is arrogance, which is conceit and all that. It's ego mainly. And Westerners are generally more, well, it's a generalization, other people, let's not say Westerners, but and other people in other cultures and other situations are expressive, generally based on a lust or a passion or an enjoyment of being expressive. And so there's this communal reaction that stimulates the chemicals in the brain, really, where we laugh and jump and sing and smile and so on. And smiling isn't always wrong, but if you think about it, some of our smiling is the indulgence in addiction. And enlightened people do smile. The Buddha smiled. There's even a special smile of the Buddha that they talk about. But there's a line, and so on the one hand, the first answer is that you have to expect a certain amount of dissonance, because you're not going to react in the ways that people expect you to. You're not going to engage, and that's common. Meditators with their families, employees with their bosses, and that sort of thing. But on the other side, I think the actual conflict generally, except in the cases where we're talking about incredibly evil people or even moderately evil people who have difficulty being around people who are mindful and get disturbed simply by your mindfulness. even in that case, a mindful person should generally, except in cases of karma, and it's not always possible, but generally speaking, I would say more often than not, the problem comes because you're overdoing it. You're over-obsessed with your own practice to the extent that you're not yet capable, or you're not acting mindfully in the situation by engaging mindfully with the other person, right? You have the sense that talking to people, it's hard to be mindful, so I'll just not talk, right? Or engaging with other people makes me unmindful, so I'll just not engage. When in fact, part of the challenge, and it is a real challenge, should be to engage mindfully. And I wouldn't be content with a lot of the dissonance that we encounter as meditators. I would try to learn how to be mindful and mindfully engage. It's not necessary, but it's going to be stressful, and it's going to actually interrupt your practice, right? The whole key from a meditator point of view is to do what doesn't disrupt your practice. And we think, and I would say erroneously, often, we think the way is to, keep back, hold back, right? And so I would look at your situation, and this is generally applicable. I think it's an interesting question, and it's certainly worth investigating. But I would always look and see whether you're actually being mindful, or whether you're just being defensive, and try and find a way to interact and react without reacting, without being emotionally involved or attached. You can be expressive, and I would argue that meditators often take the easy way out, right? It's very easy to just sit, and if someone's disturbing you, you could just close your eyes and say hearing, hearing. I don't think many meditators would argue that that's the correct way, and yet it's the easy way, and it seems intellectually correct, right? Because I'm mindful. This person's yelling at me, but I'm just saying hearing, hearing. That's not the right way. And you'll feel it. If you're truly mindful, you'll feel the impulse to just interact, but to do it mindfully, and you'll feel how much more natural that is. We're not stones. We're not just rocks that sit around all the time. The Buddha wasn't. The Arahants weren't. There are certainly times and places where you're not going to not want to engage, where engaging will only cause stress and suffering. Certainly there are people who shouldn't be engaged with, and situations where people are very angry and you just shouldn't engage with them. But I would say most of the time that's not the case. Most of the time there is a skillful way to engage. Now, hey, if you're not proficient enough, you can always retreat and admit that you're not strong enough, but you certainly have to be aware that eventually the better way is to engage, I would argue. So look at that when you're feeling this reaction from other people, because you can see it disturbs your mind, and rightly it should. Meditation isn't static. It's not just about sitting on your mat. It's about learning to be mindful in all situations, really. Okay, here's a question. Sidesh, I'm very sorry, but your English is just not good enough. I can't understand what you're asking. There's another case of it. Something to do with being angry is a type of addiction, okay? Which rise and fall. Well, being angry towards anything is like addiction. It's habitual. It becomes, you reinforce it the more you do it. So addictive, not exactly, but habitual. Based on ignorance and the fact that you're not being mindful. As you're mindful, these habits can't stand because they're stressful. And mindfulness shows you, hey, that's hurting me. And so you'll slowly give it up. This is another... Oh, who is this? Oh, Siddharth. Could everything be a consequence of overthinking? I think you're overthinking it. No, everything is not a consequence of overthinking. If you want to if you want to find the culprit and pin it on one culprit, it would be ignorance. Our problems all come from the fact that we just don't understand. And by being mindful, by observing objectively, you'll start to understand. Overthinking is just one product of not understanding. If vijnana is the result of contact between the sense organs and the scent object, does it arise along with Vedana? This is a very theoretical question. But, you know, I'm going to answer them as well. If vijnana is the result of contact, then why does it come before contact in the nidanas? Is vijnana and the nidana is different? A set of 6 that are mentioned throughout the suttas. So the vijnana in the Paticcasamuppada is referring to the moment of conception. Now that's the orthodox interpretation, but it also in other places is referring to the momentary the momentary consciousness throughout life. But there it says vijnana paccaya namarupa, namarupa paccaya vijnana. So they go in a circle. Body and mind create vijnana, vijnana creates body and mind, and that's how it goes. In fact, as far back as you go, even before conception, that's all that's going on. That being said, Paticcasamuppada is not the be-all, end-all of what's the word? Of conditionality, and it's not linear. For sure. I mean, what you're seeing is that there's something hinky here. It's not exactly A leads to B leads to C leads to D as it says, because a lot of these things come together. We say vijnana paccaya namarupa. Well, that's all to do with the process of rebirth. But in the present moment, salayatana paccaya passo. So the 6 senses lead to contact. But in fact, the moment of experience is the arising of consciousness with a sense object as its object. So the experience of seeing based on the light touching the eye. But all of that arises in one moment, and it arises together. So contact is a description of what's going on there. It's not that contact arises, in fact, it's that contact is what's going on. It's a part of the experience. And Vedana is right there in there as well. Vedana arises with consciousness. Vedana is a cetasika, and cetasika are qualities of consciousness. So when you're asking, does it arise along with Vedana? Well, yes, Vedana always arises with consciousness. It's a quality of consciousness. And contact is something that happens when consciousness arises. Consciousness arises together with its object, and the description of that is contact, or it's described as contact. So yeah, hopefully that gives you some insight. Again, it's complicated and there's a lot to talk about if you want to really understand consciousness and Vedana and all that, because it's not like you see something and there's one consciousness. There's up to 17 consciousnesses for one act of seeing, which is what we're going to be talking about in the Abhidhamma. So if you're there, you'll hopefully get a glimpse of it. Are there arahants who would still pursue their sexual desires? Well, an arahant by definition has no sexual desires, so it's not a question I can answer. It's not a valid question, because they don't have any. Is there a difference between walking meditation and mindful walking? I mean, they're words. They both contain the word walking. It depends what you mean by walking meditation and what you mean by mindful walking. I mean, practically speaking, if you just want one answer, well, let's give you two answers. Technically, from my point of view, they're different, because when we say walking meditation, we're talking about a very specific technique, right? Whereas walking mindfully is just walking. But practically speaking, they're exactly the same. Mindfulness has nothing to do with what you're doing. Mindfulness is a quality, another cetasika, a quality of mind that arises based on causes and conditions. So the hope is that it arises more when you're actually doing formal walking meditation. But nonetheless, it can arise no matter what you're doing. It can arise when you're doing mindful walking. It can arise when you're doing formal walking meditation. So from an ultimate perspective, they're just concepts. There's no such thing as walking meditation or mindful walking. There's only experiences that arise and cease. And if there's mindfulness, well, it's cultivating good things and leading towards enlightenment. When I meditate, I sometimes get overwhelmed by the meditation. I do not know why, but I do. Because of this, I am unable to sit and meditate for longer periods of time. I generally only can meditate for 5 to 10 minutes. Well, try to do walking meditation as well. You might find that helps. But it's not easy. You have to understand that meditation is challenging. It's meant to be challenging. So work on what it is that's challenging you. The overwhelmed feeling, try to say to yourself, overwhelmed. If you're restless, say restless. If you're anxious, say anxious. If you want to do something else, say wanting. We have so many distractions in our lives these days that it's very easy to get overwhelmed. It's hard to sit still, so it's a great skill to learn, something to work at. If you want, you could try doing a meditation course with me. Maybe that would help. We do online meditation courses. You can find on this site. I have a way to practice with a nun who is very versed in Abhidhamma and also meditation, very strictly aligned to the Abhidhamma. Would you recommend me to try it? Sure, sounds good. I'd be a little wary of trying to tie the Abhidhamma to meditation. It's certainly possible, but I would say most of the time it's more likely that it just gets very intellectual, so just be wary of that. Hopefully you've got a good teacher and it's all good, but wouldn't pay too much attention to the Abhidhamma. Try and be mindful. Don't worry about learning too much. Let us know how it goes. Okay, that's all the questions for tonight. So we'll end early. Thank you all for coming out. Have a good night.